Let's talk about the brain for the MCAT. And before we start, I want to make something very clear. You do not need to memorize every tiny brain structure for the MCAT. There are so many structures that you can spend hours learning anatomy that is barely relevant to the exam. For Psych Soc, what you really want to know is the major brain regions, what they do, and how to recognize them when they show up in a passage. So I'm going to focus on the high yield structures and, more importantly, explain what you should actually understand about each one. Let's start with the biggest division. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum. This is where a lot of our higher level processing occurs, including things like perception, decision making, language, and voluntary movement. For the MCAT, you should know the four major lobes: frontal, partial, temporal, and occipital lobe. And the easiest way to learn these is to connect each lobe to its major function rather than just memorizing a giant list. The frontal lobe is involved in things like planning, decision making, judgment, personality, and voluntary movement. And one particularly important part is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is involved in executive functions. Think, should I do this? What's the best decision? I need to plan ahead. So, prefrontal cortex is for planning, judgment, decision making, and impulse control. This is also important for adolescent development. Why? Because the brain's prefrontal regions continue developing into early childhood and adulthood, while emotional and reward-related systems can be highly active during adolescence. So, if the MCAT gives you a question about adolescent risk-taking or impulse control, the prefrontal cortex may be relevant. Also, in the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex. This controls voluntary skeletal muscle movement. So if you decide, I'm going to raise my hand, your motor cortex helps generate that voluntary movement. The partial lobe is heavily involved in processing somatosensory information. That includes things like touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. So if you touch something hot and your brain needs to process that sensation coming from your hand, the partial lobe is involved. And specifically, the primary somatosensory cortex is located in the partial lobe. So here's a really important pair. Primary motor cortex is in the frontal lobe, and the primary somatosensory cortex is in the partial lobe. You should know that distinction. The temporal lobe is involved in hearing, language, and memory. So if you're processing auditory information, think temporary lobe. The temporal lobe also contains structures involved in memory and language, which brings us to the two very high yield regions: Hippocampus and Wernicke's area. We'll come back to those. This one's easy. The occipital lobe is for vision. Visual information from the eyes is ultimately processed in the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. So occipital equals visual processing. Now, let's talk about language. There are two areas you should absolutely recognize: Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area equals speech production. You can remember this by thinking Broca or broduction. If Broca's area is damaged, a person can have difficulty producing fluent speech. They may know what they want to say, but struggle actually producing the language. Wernicke's area is associated with language comprehension. Someone with a damage to the Wernicke's area may produce relatively fluent speech, but have difficulty understanding the language. Their speech may also lack meaningful content. So, Broca produces speech, and Wernicke's understand language. That's the distinction I want you to know. Now, we get to one of the highest yield structures in behavioral science, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is critical for learning and forming new memories. Think about studying for the MCAT. You learn the difference between agonist and an antagonist. Your brain needs to encode that information so you can remember it later. The hippocampus is heavily involved in that process. But here's an important nuance. Don't think the hippocampus is where all memories are stored. That's too simplistic. The hippocampus is especially important for forming new memories and memory condensation. Now, let's contrast the hippocampus with another important structure, the amygdala. The amygdala is heavily involved in emotion and threat processing, especially fear. If you're walking somewhere and suddenly hear a loud noise behind you, before you consciously analyzed every detail, your brain can rapidly evaluate that stimulus and potentially threatening. The amygdala is part of the emotional process system. So, amygdala equals fear, threat, emotional processing. This is particularly important when you see MCAT passages involving fear conditioning, threat, emotional responses, and anxiety. These two are easy to mix up, so let's separate them. Hippocampus, memory formation, amygdala, emotion, fear. And they can interact. For example, imagine you have a terrifying experience. Your brain can both remember what happened and attach an emotional response to that memory. Now, this is another extremely high-yield structure. The hypothalamus is basically one of the major regulators of homeostasis. Homeostasis means maintaining relatively stable internal conditions. The hypothalamus helps regulate body temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep, reproduction, and endocrine function. So, imagine you're dehydrated. Your body needs to respond. Or you're too hot. Your body needs to respond. The hypothalamus helps coordinate many of these responses. Here's why the hypothalamus is especially important for the MCAT. The hypothalamus connects the nervous system with the endocrine system. It regulates the pituitary gland, which then controls many downstream endocrine pathways. For example, during stress, the hypothalamus stimulates CRH, which goes to the anterior pituitary, secretes ACTH to the adrenal cortex, and eventually it will secrete cortisol. That's HPA axis. So when you see a question involving the hypothalamus, don't just think temperature. Think homeostasis plus endocrine regulation plus behavior. Next is the thalamus. A good way to think about the thalamus is a major sensory relay station. It receives and relays sensory information to appropriate regions of the cerebral cortex. So imagine your sensory receptors detect something new in the environment. That information needs to reach the correct region for processing. The thalamus is involved in that relay. There is an important exception: smell. Olfactory information is unusual because the initial pathway to the cortex does not follow the same thalamic relay pattern as other major senses. For the MCAT, remember thalamus is the sensory relay, but smell is a major exception. Now let's move to the cerebellum. Think coordination, balance, and fine motor control. Imagine someone can move their muscles, but their movements are clumsy and poorly coordinated. The cerebellum should come to mind. The cerebellum helps fine-tune movement and maintain balance. Then there's the brainstem. The brainstem consists of midbrain, pons, and medulla. For the MCAT, you don't need to drown yourself in every brainstem nucleus. The brainstem is involved in things like breathing, cardiovascular regulation, arousal, and communication between the brain and the spinal cord. And one structure with the brainstem that deserves special attention is the medulla. The medulla helps regulate vital autonomic functions such as heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. Think about why this matters. You don't consciously tell your heart to beat again or to breathe. These processes help to handle that automatically. Now, the basal ganglia are something you should know as a basic MCAT level, but you don't need to memorize every individual component. The basal ganglia participate in habit learning and reward-related behavior. The substantia nigra is another structure you should recognize. It is an important connection to dopamine and movement. It's important because it involves Parkinson's disease. Degeneration of dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra contributes to motor systems of Parkinson's. Last one, the corpus callosum. It's a large bundle of nerve fibers connecting to the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Its job is to basically allow communications to both sides. And we've made it to the end. That's all you really need to know for the brain at the MCAT level. Don't try to memorize every tiny structure. Focus on being able to see the brain region and immediately connect it to its main function. If you can look at a question and think hippocampus, memory, amygdala, fear, hypothalamus, homeostasis, or occipital vision, you've got the foundation you need. The MCAT isn't trying to test you whether you can recite a textbook. It's testing whether you can use these brain function relationships to understand behavior and interpret experience. So, learn the connections, practice applying them, and move on.